with UNG, grew up in Detroit and went to college in Illinois, moved down to Florida after grad school, and have rebounded halfway back to the north. And we chose this place, this part of the country, because my wife won't move any further north. And so if we go, if we crossed the border into Tennessee, I would do it as a bachelor. So Amanda, if you introduce yourself, and then we'll get into our presentation.
Yes, glad to be here with all of you. Sorry we couldn't do this in person, but I think we all know this is kind of our new norm. I am originally from South Georgia, moved up to North Georgia about 9 years ago. And let's see, I'm working on my 7th year at UNG. And as Phil said, I'm the Assistant Vice President and the Chief Operating Officer of the Foundation.
And we'll explain why we both have 2 titles here as we get into this presentation a little bit. And Amanda, I think you're gonna drive the PowerPoint.
Yes.
So, you know, again, I am the Vice President for University Advancement. Within the University Advancement, we've got 3 functions that report through us: alumni relations and annual giving, development, and then the advancement services and donor relations. So I guess there's 4 functions that report through us. Our purpose simply is to engage alumni and friends of the university and to raise private funding to support UNG. The UNG Foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization as defined by the IRS, and our sole purpose is to receive and manage private donations to support UNG, our students, and our programs. We'll share a little bit, I'm going to share a little bit of information quickly about these areas in university advancement, and then we'll get into some detail about the UNG Foundation. The Alumni Relations and Annual Giving team reports to Wendy Hughley. I know we've got some folks here that are both current and past Alumni Association board members. Wendy's also the Executive Director of the UNG Alumni Association, which is a separate 501c3 that supports UNG alums. Within Alumni Relations, we work to engage alum through reunions, area events, many other events on and off campus. We communicate with them through newsletters, magazines, social media, and other types of communication. Within the annual giving space, Alberto Perez is our annual giving development officer. And annual giving is basically, are those gifts that occur on an annual basis that are typically smaller. And so the way that we approach those is a little bit different than the way that we approach those gifts that are larger. And we'll talk about those differences a little bit later in this presentation. On the development side, there are 8 development officers. If you can think of Corps of Cadets, athletics, and then the 5 colleges, although 2 of the colleges share one, there's places that we have development officers. And then we have a development officer that specifically works with people as they do their estate and gift planning. You know, the role of the development team here at UNG is to raise money for the university, for our students, for our programs. And I'm going to get into later a little bit more detail on the development, what our philosophy is, and some of the stats and things that we see at UNG and how those compare nationally. And, you know, the development officers do focus on people who are making larger gifts. And so they spend a lot of time on the road, getting to know people one-to-one and getting people engaged with UNG. Amanda, I think yours to take from here.
Okay. Next, I'll talk a little bit for a minute about advancement services, donor relations, and foundation operations. And these are the teams that I oversee. And you can see the staff here on the screen. First, advancement services. That includes database management, gift processing, accounting, and prospect research. So this area processes gifts, acknowledges donors, expends funds, reports both internally and externally, and we also provide research on prospects to the development and alumni teams. In addition, this group oversees our alumni database, which houses all information on our alumni and donors, and it's very important that this team maintain accurate data. The other group, Donor Relations, they work to steward our donors, manage our special donor events, such as the Scholarship Gala, and oversee donor recognition programs. This team is fairly new to our division, only a few years old, but it's very important. Their main focus is to thank our donors and show them gratitude. Both of these teams work closely with a variety of both internal and external groups to include campus fund administrators, donors, banks, auditors, and our entire advancement division. So in addition to overseeing these two departments, I also serve as the COO of the foundation, and this includes working with our foundation trustees, running foundation board meetings and our committee meetings, and oversight of the foundation's assets to include investments and real estate holdings. As you can see, the entire university advancement team is all key to providing the private support that will help further the mission of the university. Next, we'll talk a little more detail about the foundation and its operations. As Jeff mentioned, the UNG Foundation is a separate 501c3 nonprofit organization. The foundation's mission is to provide support for the University of North Georgia. The foundation is not a governing board, but instead we provide financial support for the university. We are established as a separate 501c3 organization so that we can provide gift receipts to donors. The foundation is governed by a board of trustees to include about 30 members. As we shared, Jeff is the CEO and I'm the COO. And we both work closely with foundation trustees to fundraise for new donations and to manage current foundation assets. We also work very closely with foundation leadership. Many of you may know Jimmy Faulkner. He is our board chairman, and Nick Massengill is our vice chairman. Within the foundation board, it's made up of 5 working committees, and all trustees are assigned to a committee. First, we have the development committee, whose purpose is to help with fundraising efforts and identifying donors. We have the trusteeship committee, whose purpose is to recruit new trustees and oversee our bylaws. We have the finance and audit committee, whose purpose is to oversee finances, approve our annual audit and 990 reports. We have the investment committee, who oversees the invested assets of the foundation. And last, we have an executive committee, which includes our chairman, vice chairman, and committee chairs, and they provide leadership oversight and work closely with campus administrators. Next, we'll review the various gift types that the foundation may receive. Obviously, we can take cash and credit card gifts. We can take gifts of securities, which are in the form of stocks. We can accept tangible personal gifts, which are gifts of personal property, but they must first be approved by the foundation prior to acceptance. These type of gifts are typically turned over to the university or either liquidated for the benefit of the foundation. This type of gift includes items such as artwork and real property. Next, we have planned gifts. As Jeff mentioned, we have a dedicated development officer who works specifically on planned giving. Planned gifts or deferred gifts realize their benefit to the university some years in the future. Examples of this type of gift include trust, estate gifts, and life insurance policies. And last, we have pledges. A pledge is simply a written commitment to make a gift in the future. The foundation does accept multi-year pledges up to 5 years, and booked pledges must be unconditional, meaning that they are given without condition. So when we receive a gift into the foundation, it's recorded in our database and the donor is acknowledged. The gift is then assigned to the appropriate fund for use as specified by the donor's designation. Donors will work with our development officers to establish new funds as needed. So the foundation, we currently manage over 600 different funds. designated for various scholarships and programs across campus. Each fund is governed by what we call a fund agreement, which defines the fund's purpose and is signed by the donor. The foundation is required to ensure money spent from each fund are spent according to the donor's designated purpose. So our office works with designated fund administrators across campus to ensure each fund is compliant with donor agreements. So fund administrators on campus can include the president, vice presidents, deans, or directors of a particular unit. As a nonprofit, the UNG Foundation must follow what we call fund accounting, which designates gifts in one of three different ways. First, we have unrestricted funds, and those are gifts given with no designation. You may see on a solicitation form the option of area of greatest need. This is considered an unrestricted gift. This allows the foundation to use the funds as needed or at the discretion of the board. So the foundation provides an annual unrestricted budget allocation to the president and VPs every year to be used for campus purposes. Next, we have what we call temp restricted funds. These are donor designated for a specific scholarship or program on campus. For example, if you gave a gift and it was designated to the Corps of Cadets, we will be required to hold this gift in a project designated for use by the Corps of Cadets. The entire balance of temp restricted funds are available for expenditure at any time. The last type of fund, which is a little more complicated, is called endowed funds. Endowed funds are given by a donor to be held permanently and invested in a long-term pool. $25,000 funded over 5 years is the minimum amount to establish an endowed fund. Because these funds are invested long-term, they receive earnings distributions. Endowed funds receive an annual spending budget from the earnings balance. The annual spending budget is around 4% of the endowment's total value. So, the larger the endowment value, the greater the annual spending budget is. The foundation does charge a 1% annual administrative fee on endowed funds. This fee helps to support our operating costs and also fund our unrestricted budget allocations provided to campus administrators. Endowed funds are a great way for donors to make a permanent legacy and gift to UNG. Again, I'll reiterate, it is important to note that we are required to follow the donor's designation for these fund classifications, and a donor has to provide us documentation for their designation. Also, I'll mention that the foundation does not charge a gift fee, unlike many other nonprofits that do. Last, I'll talk just a minute about compliance. So in addition to being governed by the Foundation Board of Trustees, we must be compliant with laws and regulations to include the IRS. We must be consistent with the donor's intent for the gift. We are subject to public scrutiny and audit to include the open records request. All of our expenditures must support the university mission and be reasonable amount and necessary. And finally, we must adhere to UNG Foundation and Board of Regents policies and procedures. And I think next, Jeff is gonna share with you some development information.
Yeah, so I hope you see by the time that we're done talking today why we're so grateful for your willingness to help raise money for Corps Cadets at UNG. And I see I see Jim Solomon has joined us and John Thompson have joined us. These guys have been involved for a little while. Because of the small size of our team, your role is critical to the success of our Corps Cadets, especially when it comes to bringing outside resources in for them. You bring a very credible presence, and we greatly value your wisdom, your generosity, and your willingness to be involved in a meaningful way. And I'm going to give you some facts and figures, some UNG data and some national data, and I hope that illustrates why we feel so grateful for that. Our fiscal year just ended on June 30th, and so we don't have audited numbers to share with you, but I will share with you just some idea of the kind of year we had. It's sort of funny. We think that the year that just ended will likely be a record setter. But then you go to July 1 and you're at 0. And you start all over again from the beginning. And a part of the reason we think that this past year will be a record setter is that when the governor just signed into the budget the approval to build the new Mike Cottrell College of Business building, and that process was started with a $10 million lead gift by Mike Cottrell. And so when the governor signed that, that met the last requirement for that. And so we'll be able to book that pledge this June. And so that will be a transformational facility for the campus and the region. There are some people that are the opinion that we're in the most competitive industry in philanthropy. And part of that reason is the small ones aren't eaten by the bigger ones. In 1998, there were just shy of 600,000 public charities in the U.S. registered with the IRS, 597,236 to be exact. In 2015, that number had grown to almost 1.1 million. It's 82% growth in 17 years. When you look inside the higher ed space, alumni support of higher education in general across the board has decreased dramatically since the 70s. And part of that reason is that you have many more charitable options. I'm going to give you more specific data on alumni giving in a later slide nationally, but to give you some bigger numbers, so the national average of alumni support for all universities, public and private, is 9%. That's the national average. Anybody take a guess at what the top institution in the nation is? About 59%. It's actually Princeton. No public universities are in the top 10. And when you get to the bottom end of the top 10, it's about the low 40s percent-wise. Public higher ed, the national average of alumni support public higher ed is 6%. And UNG is right on that national percentage, 6% and change. So you can see why we're so grateful for your generosity is you're among the top 6% of people that support our students and cadets each year. The other bit of good news for that in the role that you've signed on is that there's 94% of our people that we have an opportunity to grow philanthropically, and that's a role that you can help us play there. Phil had asked me to share a little bit about our philosophy when it comes to higher ed, and I think what's very important to us is that we want people to give to something they're passionate about. We don't want to try to twist somebody's arm into giving to something they're not passionate about, because the more passionate the person is, the better the happier they're going to be with their philanthropy, and the more impactful and the longer they're going to give. And so that's the first thing, is we want people to give to something that they feel good about. The second thing is we take very seriously our role of stewarding well. And I think we define stewarding well by saying thank you quickly and properly. If you don't get the thank you, the IRS receipt right out of the gate, you create trust issues. And so doing the simple things well, say thank you quickly and properly, then it also involves managing and investing those resources well. If you don't take care of the assets you have, it's hard to get new ones. And so we think that stewardship is critically important as well. Fundraising has become critical in higher ed today. I think about, I'll use Jim Solomon's era as an example. When Jim was a student at UNG, probably the state provided 80% of the support came from state appropriations. Today, that number's in the low 40s. And, so if you think about, we went from 80% state supported to 40% state supported. And one of my pet peeves is there's a national narrative that the cost of higher education has gone up. And I will tell you, the price of higher education has gone up. The cost to educate a student, if you look at it adjusted for inflation over the last 15 years, the cost to educate a student has been flat. We've simply transferred in the public higher ed space that cost from the state to the family. And so price has gone up, but it's not because we're spending so much more money to educate a student than we were 15 years ago. And so, when you have such a gap in what the state can no longer do, and from what then that families can and can't do, a part of the way you make up that gap is you have to charge more in tuition. But the other part of the way you make up that gap is you bring in private support and philanthropy that helps take those burdens off families. It helps take those burdens off the facilities. Using Jim Solomon's era as another example. So when Jim was a student, any facility that was needed, the state just simply built it. And as much as the state has grown, the state right now will build a handful of buildings a year. If you had to just get in line and wait for the state to build a facility, I'll use our Convocation Center as a real example, almost 20 years in the making. One of the things now within the university system is a part of the reason you see the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech get the lion's share of the facilities is because they bring private support, sometimes as much as half into the facility. Mike Cottrell College of Business is a great example. About a third of the cost of that facility that's coming is in private support. And so you move up to the top of the list if you can leverage private giving. What's difficult for us is you'll see as you talk to folks, so if you talk to someone from Jim's era and you talk to them about the importance of expanding the Pennington Military Leadership Center, you're likely to get an answer that, well, if this was so important, the state would just do it. And the days of waiting for the state to just do it are long past. And the history of this institution and having the state just build facilities, the state doesn't do that anymore. And which means the future of this institution is going to be shaped by the people who care about it the most. Mike Cottrell cares a great deal about that College of Business in this region, and that gift made that facility happen so much quicker. I want to share with you some trends that we're seeing both in higher ed and how they relate to UNG. And this first slide that we have up shows basically it shows you have the top part, gifts that are less than $1,000, gifts that are more than $1,000. And you can see the percentage of gifts that came in that were less than 1,000, those total, and gifts that were more than 1,000. And then in the bottom, you see the number of donors that gave less than 1,000 and more than 1,000. And what you can take from this slide is that in fiscal year 2019, the last year we have audited data for, 94% of our total cash gifts came from 15% of our donors. I will tell you nationally, 90% of the dollars come from 10% of the donors. And so, again, you can see why that focus on people who are giving more than $1,000 is so critical, because 94% of the gifts that are coming in from that group. Amanda, if you go to the next slide. A question that I get asked often is where does money come from UNG, and how do we compare? And again, if you notice over the last 4 years, our alumni giving, ranges from a low of 33% to a high of 70% of dollars that are coming in from alums. Also keep in mind that you can have a large gift that skews that a good bit. And in 2019, you had the Lamb estate that skewed that a good bit, 3 million and change, I think, that we booked at that point in time. But you can see individuals give about 86% last year of the gifts that came from individuals. I will tell you that's about national average. Over 80% of the charitable giving in this country comes from people. I point that out to you all in your role as the CAC because, if I had $1 for every time somebody said, I think Coca-Cola would support that. Corporate giving in this country, while it's important, doesn't come anywhere near the level of giving from individuals. And so while we certainly need to add more corporate giving to our giving, let's recognize that if we're just average, about 20% of our giving will come from non-individual sources. Amanda, if you'll go to the next slide. I want to share with you some interesting, when we look at our new donor growth. And as you can see over the last 3 years, we have seen a lot of new donors. Now I'm going to give you the bad news in the next slide, but this is the good news slide. We've seen a lot of new donors. What's interesting is that new donors who gave less than $10,000, our retention rate from the first year to the second year is 25%. That's horrible. That means if someone makes a new gift, only 1 in 4 make a gift the next year. Now, the national average for that is 34%. And I'll give you one reason that the national average, why that's so low, is keep in mind there are a lot of people in that number that will make a gift for a specific cause or person from a memorial standpoint, you know, that doesn't have any intent, they don't have any connection to us. Somebody passes away, they're making a gift in their honor. And so, you know, there's a fair amount of folks that will do that, that will be a new donor, that they'll never make you another gift. And so, so our first year retention rate on a new donor is not well when you look at national average. What's interesting is when you go retention rate of donors who give 2 consecutive years, meaning that person that made a gift the first year gives the second year. Now our retention rate jumps to 61% to year 3. The national average is 55%. If we get a person to give 5 consecutive years, now we keep them at a 90% rate from year to year. And so, you know, as we think about making those decisions and what do we do with that data, if we can figure out how to get a person to give us a new donor, to give us a gift in year 2, we have gone a long way to keeping them as a donor moving forward. Next slide, please. So a few trends from the UNG Foundation from a scorecard standpoint. So our total assets have grown about 49% since 2014. Endowment has grown 32% since 2015. Nationally, there is more money being raised from ever from an aging, shrinking pool of donors. 2 of those 3 things are true at UNG. At UNG, more money than ever is being raised from an aging pool of donors. You notice from the last slide, our pool is not shrinking. We've grown a fair number of donors in the last 4 years. When you look at a top 100 donor, meaning when you rank them by dollar amounts that they gave, our top 100 donors average age last year was 73. Of those top 100, we only had 10 that were under the age of 60. All of them were at least 55. And again, keep in mind, 94% of our giving is coming from a top 15% of our donors. Next slide, please, Amanda. Our total number of cash donors increased 11% since 2016. We've attracted many new donors over the last couple of years. Our retention rate of those new donors from year 1 to year 2 is poor and below the national average. However, if we keep a new donor 2 years, our retention rate goes up. Certainly if we keep them 5 years, we keep them almost at 90%. Next one, please. There's a great article about 1.5 years ago about why fundraising needs fixing from a philanthropic standpoint. And I'm going to share with you some national data, share with you how UNG fits into that. But in a nutshell, think about in higher ed, more money being raised than ever from an aging, shrinking pool of donors. Top 100 donor national stat is about 70. Those folks are continuing to age out and to pass away. As that population is getting older, what has not been replaced are by those folks that are now in their 40s and 50s becoming those top 100 donors. When you see a stat in a second of the average age of a top 100 donor 40 years ago, it was much younger. And there are many of us that believe in higher ed, if we don't begin to attract different donors, more alums, younger alums to give, probably not in 10 years, but certainly in 20 years, the wheels are going to come off. There'll be a huge crisis of philanthropy in public higher education in general, because you're raising more money than ever from an aging, shrinking pool of donors. I want to show you some stats of how we compare to those national stats. Amanda, next slide, please. So across the board from this article, institutions of higher ed netted $44 billion in donations in 17, record-setting year. And I will tell you, we've continued to top that in 18 and 19. Inside those top line numbers, though, more than 2/3 of colleges and universities saw their number of donors drop between 2007 and 15 by an average of 27%. Next slide, please. So you look at UNG. In 2007, we had 5325 cash donors. In 2015, there were 3604. So nationally, universities lost 27% in that time. At UNG, we lost 32% of our cash donors in that 8 years. Next slide, please. The good news for us, though, is that we've seen an increase since 2015 at 12%. I will tell you of institutions that work with the company that manages our data, it is less than a fourth are seeing growth in both dollars and donors. Almost every higher education institution is hemorrhaging donors. And so for us to have growth since 2015 is extraordinary because most places are thrilled to be flat. Next slide, please. You know, I think one of the most troubling things is that higher ed is compensating for fewer donors by relying heavily on the wealthy, particularly the super rich. And again, you look nationally, the top 10% of donors nationally account for an average of 92% of the dollars raised. If you go to the next slide, you'll see again, remember our number, the top 15% of our donors are accounting for 94% of the dollars raised. So as you can see, we are about spot on national average with some of what we're seeing nationally philanthropically to higher ed. If you go to the next slide, please. It's certainly not clear how long big donors can keep giving those big dollars. So in 1977, the median age of people who became a top 100 donor was 53. In 2017, that average age had risen to 67. Next slide, please. At UNG in 2019, the average age of our top 100 donor was 71.5. In 18, it was 69. In 17, it was 71. Next slide, please. You know, I'll share an interesting, you know, as we began to bring this topic to our foundation board, I'll tell you the first time that I tried to bring this topic up, it got laughter because we're raising more money than ever. And the reaction from the executive committee was, this is just Jeff being Jeff. He's never happy. And so I realized that that's not the reaction one wants. And so I sat down with Dr. Jacobs and said, hey, we got to get people's attention because if we don't do some things differently, in 15 to 20 years, maybe as few as 10, the wheels will come off. And Dr. Jacobs jokingly said, hey, I won't be here in 20 years. And I said, now I know you're joking. I know you meant that as a joke. I said, the problem is the people in your job and the people in my job for 40 years have kicked the can down the road. And now we're at the point where the piper has sent an invoice. And, you know, if we don't do some things differently, if we don't collect with alumni differently, if we don't engage more people while still stewarding well our very best donors, there is going to be a huge problem here in a decade. And so I want you to recognize that that is going on in higher ed in general. And I will tell you, UNG is spot on national average in that. And now I will tell you, there is nobody doing this well. There's not a model out there for us to copy. And so I think we've got to recognize we want to be on the front edge of this. And the other part of that is to recognize that we need the solution to be uniquely UNG. Next slide, please. So again, what does it mean? More dollars being raised than ever from an aging, shrinking pool of donors. Aging donor population is not being replaced with the pipeline of younger donors, and loyalty to higher education is shrinking dramatically. It's happening at UNG. We are spot on national average. Next one up. You know, when I think about, I'm going to single Mark out because I see he has joined us. And, you know, as we think about, so Mark's era, it is time for them to begin joining the rest of you that have been so generous. Those are folks that are at that point in their lives and their careers. And you know, even Mark's era, you know, they're not kids. You know, we've got to begin attracting those people as they graduate earlier. What's interesting, again, to compare Jim's era, what's interesting is in Jim's era, if you look at our stats, and this is true nationally, when Jim Solomon graduated, very few of his classmates gave to UNG right away. But as the years have gone on, their giving has dramatically increased from that era. If you look at those students that have graduated in the last 5 years, many of them make a first gift to us quickly. Actually, the better data to look at is over 15 years. Those that have graduated in the last 15 years, a high percentage make a gift quickly, but then over the course of 15 years, that giving dramatically drops. And I think one of the things that we need to be sure that we're communicating well, the $10 million gift from a Mike Cottrell gets all of the press. It moves the needle. You put a facility there. But I will tell you, our lifeblood of giving are those alums that are giving us $1,000 a year. You add those all up together, it's impactful. And I think it's difficult for a College of Business alum to feel, a 2015 College of Business alum that says, we got a guy giving us 10 million. What difference does my $500 gift make? Well, it makes a huge difference if you put all of them together with your classmates, and really moves the needle. And I think we need to begin doing a better job of showing, hey, how does every gift make a difference? Because you put a lot of those $1,000 gifts together, they move the needle. And again, those are the lifeblood for us here at UNG. In the role that you've taken on as a CAC, I would say that you are certainly the example of how a group works well, a volunteer group works well. Certainly the highest functioning of the advisory boards that we have. The Nighthawks Athletic Board is working hard to catch up to you, and they've made some great strides. Some of the colleges are beginning to put together advisory boards specifically to communicate with alums about some of the things that are going on in those colleges. But without the strong support of alums and volunteers, again, we just don't have a big enough team to make the kind of impact that we need to here. So those groups are critical for us, and being able to bring in resources to our cadets, students. Certainly when you look at, what's on the horizon from Corps cadets, and I think Phil will share this with you, but scholarships are always a top priority, especially when you see how much the state support has shrunk. Certainly right now, the expansion of the Military Leadership Center is critical. As our cadets, those of you that have been in that facility know that it is embarrassingly small for the size Corps that we have. And then certainly the support of operations is critical for the Commandant and his team to be able to provide those experiences that the state either can't provide or he doesn't have the resources to provide are critical in there. And so that gets us through, it's the planned portion of our presentation. I would love to answer any questions that anybody has, or if there's anything else that you'd like us to address.
Hey, Jeff, this is Barry Barr. Just a couple quick comments and a question for you. It's obviously a concern that the age of donors is getting older. It's not a surprise. People are working longer, and you require that income that's not disposable yet to them. So that's not a surprise. And, of course, politics and tax laws and the economy makes a huge difference on what giving looks like in any given year or decade. We've seen a decade or more now of a stagnant market where the higher net worth people just aren't making as much as they may have made in the past. But that's obviously a concern, and replacing the pipeline with new donors as the olders die or whatever the case may be is obviously important. But, sometimes it's, in my experience in other organizations, it's sometimes easier to go increase a current donor's gift than it is to get a new donor. So we still need to build that pipeline, but get that $1,000 to raise it to $2,000. That seems to be an easier task than it is to get a first-time donor. Quick question for you: the top 100, as far as we're concerned, what level of giving is number 100?
$5,000.
Thanks.
And Barry, to your point about, we've got to do both. We've got to increase giving from existing donors and find new donors. You got to do both to be able to survive, to be able to kind of make the kind of impact that we need to make here.
Hey, Jeff, this is Jim Solomon. Hey,
Hey, Jim.
back when I was there, the state was still funding the horses and wagons, and we did well, so I appreciate the examples. But hey, could you talk a little bit about the planning that you guys are doing, the strategic plan, the surveys and things like that that's ongoing?
Yeah, so we just completed a feasibility study where to take a look at what does a new model need to be. And one of the things, when places do feasibility studies, typically what they do is they interview just their very best donors, the people who are closest to them. And because we want to solve the pipeline issue, we realized we couldn't do that. We couldn't interview just those that were closest to us because we have a pipeline issue. And so we brought a consultant in who did a large number for most feasibility studies, but he did 40 interviews. And then we did another couple of hundred as a staff where we sat and talked with people and, wanting to find out, one, what are people's perceptions of the institution, but also what will they support philanthropically? What are those, as we begin to look at how do we raise money in this day and age, what will people support? And one of the things that we're thinking about, we're all familiar with, we've seen groups that we're a part of that do these 7 to 10 year, a $500 million capital campaign or comprehensive campaign. And those are not successful anymore. There's a lot of data out there that suggests that those aren't, I'll let you know the secret how those work. You'll never find one that fails. Because what they do is they kick off, we're going to raise $500 million. They count back however many number of years until they get to half of that dollar amount and say, well, this actually started 3 years ago. And so, you put a big number up there, but you don't put a lot of real money in. And when Amanda and I got here, we agreed that's not how we want to do this. If we're going to raise $1,000, there's going to be $1,000 raised. And so we think a way, and this tested very favorably, was as opposed to saying, hey, over 10 years, we're going to raise $300 million for these causes. We're going to sit there and say, hey, as opposed to looking at that way, over the next 2 or 3 years, what are the most important things that we need to be focused on? And the other thing that the big comprehensive campaign doesn't account for, it assumes that each of you is only interested in one thing. And, I don't know that that's true for any of us. And, if in a typical comprehensive campaign, you would have to pick the one project you want to be a part of. If we look at it this way, smaller goals, very targeted, there might be 2 or 3 things that you might be interested, but you're not having to do those all at one time. And so, Jim, as you know, we were supposed to present those findings to the foundation board at their June meeting. And if the board had an in-person June meeting, we'd have done that. We are now planning to present those findings to the board at the October meeting. And we are keeping our fingers crossed that we have an October meeting that isn't the way we're doing this right now. And so we felt that that was too important to do virtually. We still feel that way, but if you would have told me in March that there would be a chance we wouldn't have an October board meeting, I would have told you were crazy. And I think now we're all hoping we have an October board meeting. Other questions or comments?
Hey, Jeff, it's Mark Young. Can you hear me?
I can, Mark. How are you?
Hey, I'm fine. Thanks, everybody. Question. I was, as you were saying the fact about where the money comes from, I was thinking back to when I was a cadet and how I didn't realize where the money came from. I was just trying to basically survive day to day, especially when I was a younger cadet. But just knowing that fact now, I wonder how I would have felt about my responsibility as an alumni in terms of giving once I graduated, if there had been some type of touch point on me or communication or messaging to what my actual responsibilities were as an alumni, as a graduate of such a great place. Because as I graduated, I thought my only responsibility was to serve as, work as hard as I could and serve honorably and those types of things, or, however that might translate to someone who's not a cadet. That's what was in my mind when I left the organization, when I left the school. So fast forward to about 2001, I was at West Point, and although they do a lot of things wrong, one of the things I noticed that they did was after they briefed new cadets on the Army values and the mission of West Point, the next briefing was about the long gray line and what your responsibilities are in terms of giving back to the institution after you leave. I mean, that started on day one of Beast Barracks New Cadet, and it continued, you know, year to year to year through the life cycle of a cadet. So by the time you had a graduate, you had a person who knew, or who was, I don't want to use the word indoctrinated, but who was messaged and taught that, yeah, there is some responsibility to return something in some way, whether it's money or service, to the organization that just produced you out. And it was a lot of work they put into that through their messaging and communications efforts, and just believing their own hype and creating an effort to give back to the organization. I know that was not in me, and I don't know if it was in my classmates. And, you know, I was remiss all those years, you know, of a career of giving back anything to the organization other than my word of mouth bragging of how great it was and what it gave me as an officer, as a leader. So I don't know what the rules are in terms of touching cadets and making them understand through messaging how important it is to give back. I don't know if that's something we've been doing over the past years, or if you think that's something the CAC can help with to do better. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Mark, I think that's something that CAC can help us do way better. And I think the powerful part of that is you telling that to a incoming freshman is way more powerful as an alum and as a person who is giving than that coming from a professional staff member. And, you know, I think the responsibility is something that you all can help with tremendously. Especially I think about things like Boar's Head Weekend. You know, are a great time to talk about, hey, when you leave here, you know, what's your responsibility to give back? You know, and the other part of it, Mark, I think a lot of students, understandably, they don't really understand what is a foundation, what is philanthropy. You know, I think giving them the opportunity to interact with you all who are donors shows them a face of that. I think we also see, and I don't know that I have hard data on this. I have a lot of anecdotes on this, but when a scholarship recipient can meet their scholarship donor, boy, that now suddenly it's this isn't some nebulous pot of money that this came from. This person or this group gave this so that I can continue my education. That has a powerful of showing that responsibility of when you get out your desire to give back. You know, I'll use an example of something that you may want to think about. So some of you may have read, we have a local gentleman by the name of Tommy Bagwell. His family gave us $1 million last year. Basically, he made a 5-year pledge of $200,000 a year for scholarships to be given out. And one of the things he asked of the students is he wanted them to sign a pledge that promised at some point in their life, when they have the ability to give back, that they give to something. And in honor of the fact that he gave to them. And we had him to meet a number of his students just before. In fact, it was I left Mr. Bagwell to head to Mr. Solomon. I left for the airport right after he left our campus. And it opened a lot of those students' eyes to what philanthropy is. And that, you know, there are people that do this. And it was interesting. One of the questions he asked of them is, what are you so passionate about now that you would support now, even if it's with $1? And it was really interesting how a lot of students, when they had to sign that pledge, got to thinking about the role that they can play even as a young person philanthropically by simply giving up a trip to Starbucks a week. And so I think, Mark, that's a very powerful thing that could come from the CAC, is to helping showcase that responsibility and why that's important.
Jeff, I'll piggyback on what Mark just said. I agree what you just said, where the message should come from. But, you know, we were taught a lot of things at North Georgia. I was never taught to give. We had an ethics class, I think, in our first year of MS courses. You know, hopefully we all got an A in that class because it was about what we stood for anyway. But you know, I think it's well worth a discussion with the military department about adding that into the curriculum somewhere, not a course by itself, but just adding it as an additional item that we're taught from day one, not only how to wear the uniform, but the responsibilities we have after we leave North Georgia. I like what Mark's saying on that. That's just my input on that.
Jeff, if I could jump in here for a second. One of the things that we have that I think all of us who've been on the CAC for a few years are excited about is the 1-2 punch of the NGCCA combined with the CAC. So not only do we have CAC membership, but we have the NGCCA members and leaders who are taking that message for the first time ever in the last 2 to 3 years to incoming freshmen and then later to seniors. I think we can do a much better job filling in the gap in between. And Mark's example of the long gray line and how they start to, I'll use the word indoctrinate because they send bills after they graduate. They don't send asks. But if we can fill in that gap between that first year, the fourth year, and build that, I think that's something certainly that the CAC and the NGCCA are capable of doing if they operate together.
Hey, Jeff, this is John, and I'll just add to that. I think, and Mark brings up a good point, but the secret sauce to West Point's giving is that, you know, they don't necessarily, they do ultimately give back to the academy, but it revolves around the class that they graduated from. It's a very cohesive class, and that's how they build the bulk of their giving efforts. And it's something similar that General Johnson sort of started with the class of 75 giving campaign, which I think deserves more exploration but realizing that our classes are so small that may, you know, not be as effective as, you know, something as big as West Point or the Naval Academy, but I do think it's worth benchmarking potentially against the other 6 military schools, given that, you know, the vast majority of them are private, but how they do their campaign giving as well, or structure their campaign giving.
Yeah, I would agree with that, John. I think part of our strength also lies in the fact that we are a little more smaller and close knit. Like if you call a name of someone in the class of '94, I can pretty much say with about 90% certainty that I know that. Like I literally know that person or have some knowledge of them. And I think sometimes West Pointers, just based on my own experience there, they know their class, but they don't all know each other because they're so large. So there are a lot of times there's not a feeling of putting their arms around each other based on just their class. So I think even our small size works in our advantage because I would feel comfortable picking up a phone and calling a Josh T-Tech because, you know, I used to deal with Josh every day and we've kept in touch over the years and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that even works in our advantage a little bit. So you're right, though. It is definitely based on class. It's based on class motto and different things like that that really make them cohesive as a group in terms of giving. So that process can start pretty early also. So, yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
Jeff, Jim Melton, as the outgoing president of the Alumni Association, let me just tell you that you would be appalled at the number of your classmates, military or not, if you graduated later, who are not members of the Alumni Association for $35 a year, I mean. And so as you look at it, it's an indoctrination thing, but I think you're absolutely right, Mark, we need to get early, but we don't just need to limit this. I know the CAC is worried about the military department, but if we could integrate the rest of the student body with the military department and try to encourage that, I think we'd see our giving at the University of North Georgia go up considerably. Again, I know we're focused just in the CAC on the military side of it for military scholarships and funding, but it is a function of apathy. As I said, if you were to ask Wendy for a list of your class of who are members of the Alumni Association, you would be appalled. So trying to get those same alumni now to give not only to the Alumni Association, but to now increase their giving to the CAC. I think that's going to be a proposition that needs to start, as Mark said, much, much earlier in their attendance at UNG.
John, to piggyback on what you were talking about with regard to classes, I guess the best example that we have, Phil, you can step in, is the Eagle Fund that was created by the class of 66 with contributions or collaboration with class of 65, 67, I believe, as far out as 68. It's been a huge success over the past few years, pushing at one time until we went through the COVID and the stock market was pushing close to 850,000, I think, in the fund. But that there are other means, but that's certainly one means by class for giving back to the core and to the university, Jeff, as you broaden it out. Jeff, I'd like to ask you a question. If you can tell us any initiatives that you think would benefit us for first-time givers to hold them as a second and a third giver, that might be helpful to us as we look to the future in the CAC.
You know, Jim, I think, so I'm going to give you what I think. I don't know the answer. If we knew the answer to this, we'd be doing it. You know, when I think about one of the challenges, let's use the $100 donor. So a person that gives $10,000 is going to hear from a development officer. You're going to know in person how much it's appreciated. That person that gives $100, you know, Jim, we don't have the staff size to send a development officer to thank that person in person. And so, you know, we've got to figure out, how do we let that person know that we are grateful? And certainly, you know, we will have student phone-a-thon callers call them once a year to say thank you. But we've got to figure out how to have them know that we are grateful for that $100 gift. And I think one of the things the Eagle Fund does really well is those, as volunteers, they call those folks. They call them to thank them. They call them to ask them again. And, you know, I think, Jim, if you know, if there's a way, now, again, I'm not sure that CAC is large enough to call everybody that gives $20, but, you know, it might be good to take a look at, hey, of those that are supporting the Corps of Cadets, you know, is there a small group in the CAC or a few people that are willing to pick up the phone once a year and call a dozen people and say, hey, I saw you made this gift, you know, I want you to know how much we appreciate it. Here's what we used it for, and not ask, just a good old fashioned thank you. I think we've got to figure out how to make that personal, recognizing we don't have unlimited resources to do so.
Thanks. Under Bud's leadership this past year, the communications committee has focused a lot on that. And we're going to continue to focus heavily on thanking donors in an expeditious manner, regardless of the amount, whether it's a note or depending upon the size of the donation, a letter from me or a letter from the president of the university with a follow-up call, etc. We have that. We've just developed a policy. I don't know if you participated in that or not, Jeff, but there was a policy developed that we're going to lay out to the CAC council, or the CAC, and have them approve it and then implement the provisions of that. And I think that'll go a long way. We made a big step in the past year. We want to now implement it and institutionalize it for the future.
You know, I've seen some interesting ideas out there for sort of more marketing than they really are stewardship. I'll give you a silly one that so I think it's University of Chicago. Apparently University of Chicago, you know, very old historic place, has a speed bump on campus that I guess is basically an old brick road that has bubbled up. And so they can't fix it because of the history of it, but it's something that everybody, part of the culture. And so I feel like it's for $100, you can have that speed bump named for you for a day. And they found that they got huge response to that. That on August 1, it's the Jim Craven's speed bump. And, I think about, are there some ways that we can attract people that wouldn't otherwise normally give and then keep them giving? Are there some things as a part of our culture that are there that we're not thinking of? And also where that person feels like they got a lot of bang for their buck for the $100 gift.
I think people would appreciate knowing how much their gift means by showing the statistics you showed earlier. That person that says Mike Cottrell gave $10 million or $20 million, what's my $500 check mean to the school? Not much. But if you just show them in one sentence, this is where you fall on the graph. This is what your check really does mean to the organization. It might mean more.
Right. Good point.
Any other questions or comments, folks? Good presentation. Thanks so much. But any other questions or information you want to share?
No, we greatly appreciate what you all do and your involvement and your generosity.
Okay, General Craven, General Thrasher, anything?
No, we're going to pick your brain a lot, Jeff, in the future on the how on many of these things. I'd like to get, you obviously are invited to every meeting and make presentations on that, but we want to get, I'd like to get you down into the weeds with the how ideas that you just mentioned a moment ago to broaden our aperture on things that we can do to improve donations, giving, etc. in the future. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you're very welcome. That feeling is mutual. I mean, if we knew all the answers, we would put them out there.
Yeah, I know.
So you guys bring a perspective that's critically important. And always appreciate your invitations. And again, I wish we were doing this in person. I'm a little concerned that I haven't seen those trees move where Jim Melton is sitting. And so I hope that's not a sign of bad weather rolling in. And at least campus security hasn't come to get him yet.
That's my virtual background. So.
Jeff, I'd just like to say thanks for all your support and Amanda's support. And having you come to the CAC meetings every time is really very helpful. And I know Jim will work on that too. So, but again, thanks and a very excellent presentation today.
Yeah, thank you all.
Okay, folks, that does it for today. Thank you so much. We'll see most of you tomorrow at noon for the NGCCA presentation. And Mark, I think you'll learn a little bit more about what they're doing and how the two entities work together. So thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we'll talk.
Thank you, Phil.